Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells, and I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I'm going back to The One Ring, one of, one of my all-time favorites. And we're going to look at Tales from Wilderland, and this is the same default setting that we've talked about a couple of times before. The core game of The One Ring takes place in between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and in the area in and around Mirkwood. So from the Misty Mountains, Vale of Anduin, Mirkwood, and then the Lonely Mountain, that whole area, that's what we're talking about. So the core game talks about that. The setting book about the Wilderland talks about that, and then the campaign, The Darkening of Mirkwood, is all about that as well. So what Tales from the Wilderland is it is 7 adventures that are sort of connected, but mostly just one-shots that are designed to kind of just showcase different parts of the Wilderland. You can combine them with the campaign if you want. You can just run it as a loosely connected mini-campaign. You can slot them in wherever. There's 7 adventures. Now, right off the bat, I will tell you that 2 of the major faults of the book are A, it doesn't really showcase the Wilderland, which is ostensibly its purpose. Most of the adventures take place in the Vale of Anduin, and, well, I won't say that. 3 or 4 of them take place in the Vale of Anduin. There's one of them that takes place in Dale, and one of them that's in the Withered Heath. There's only actually 1 out of all 7 that involves Mirkwood in any way, which just feels like a missed opportunity to me. That's kind of what I came into the book looking for. I can understand that maybe they decided that the Darkening of Mirkwood campaign dealt with Mirkwood enough, and so here were a bunch of adventures that dealt with the Wilderland without getting into Mirkwood. Maybe that's what they were going for. I don't know, but that is a point against it. Let's call it that. Number 2, the story that it does tell, to the extent that they are connected. 4 of the 7 are strongly connected in that they follow a single antagonist, although you don't really have to have played any of those adventures in order to lead into the others. They can still stand on their own. The arc that those adventures tell doesn't make a ton of sense. Some of the ways in which they are connected, such as the Chain of Thangorodrim, are really cool. Others don't. Like I said, most of this stuff takes place in the Vale of Anduin, and we get to deal with this bad guy who's called the Gibbet King, and he is in the Vale of Anduin, and he's trying to do this, and he's trying to do that, and he's trying to do all these horrible things, and then all of a sudden, he, in one of the adventures, mounts a giant attack, raises a huge army, and takes it over to Dale. Doesn't bother with the Vale of Anduin in any way, which just feels, from a storytelling perspective, like it comes out of nowhere. Anyway, let's put all that aside, and let's talk about the good stuff, which is that the adventures themselves are great. Of the 7, 1 is pretty poor, 2 are kind of dull, and the other 4 are unilaterally fantastic. Remember my rule, I don't review books on this channel unless I recommend them, and I do heartily recommend this one. There are 4 adventures in it which are stellar, and which I am very excited to run some players through. I haven't yet. Anyway, let's talk about them a little bit. The very first one is the only one that deals with Mirkwood, and it's kind of dull. This is one of the 2 passable ones that I was talking about. You're basically escorting a merchant from Dale to the other side, like over to Bjorn's house or whatever. And it's just the Hobbit, Mirkwood, in reverse. There's the stream that steals memories. There's the spiders that attack people. Like, it's all the Mirkwood stuff that you've already seen. There is absolutely no narrative through line whatsoever to the adventure. It's just a series of random encounters, except they're not random because it tells you what to do. But they don't connect to each other, they don't build toward anything, it's just, here's a bunch of scary things in the woods. Yay, you survived and now you're out of the woods. As an introduction to the One Ring, I actually think it would work really well. If you want to say, here's how the game works, here's how the travel system works, all of that sort of thing, you could do that. I will also add that this adventure, and in fact all 7 of the adventures in Tales from Wilderland, do a phenomenal job of using the encounter system, which is kind of like a formalized version of talking to people, convincing people to do things. It's their version of like social combat, I guess is the way that you could phrase it. And in the core book, it never really gelled for me. This book, this series of adventures, every single one of them uses that encounter system and uses it really, really well. Even this first one, that's kind of a weird, boring adventure, still manages to use the encounter system really well. So, if for no other reason than learning how to use the encounter system and how to really make it sing, this is fantastic. Anyway, that first one could be fun and serves as a good introduction, but you're going to want to get over it quickly and move on to the rest of them. Number 2, let's actually get in and I can show you. Big PDF. Here we go. Boom. So, how to use this book. So we have, we don't want to get all the way there yet. We want to look at these. Okay, so the second was called Of Leaves and Stewed Hobbit, and this is one of the fantastic, amazing, really good adventures, which basically has you trying to rescue a hobbit, realizing he's been kidnapped by goblins, and then rescuing him from the goblins, which sounds straightforward, but the way that it is designed is, first of all, the hobbit is a chef, and so the goblins have kidnapped him specifically so that he can prepare them a feast, which just adds to the fun. It gets back to kind of the goofy side of the goblins a little bit, still very dangerous, but the goofy side that we saw in The Hobbit, as opposed to the just straight up sniveling villain side that we see from Lord of the Rings. Second, the other thing that makes this adventure work really well is that the process of rescuing that hobbit can go in so many different directions. You can go full combat. You can charge in there and just start attacking. You'll probably lose, but there are ways to do it. There are ways to sneak through and ambush people. You could go full stealth and just sneak around in the goblin cave. You could also do this as a social encounter and go through the goblin cave convincing them to help you or tricking them into letting the hobbit go, all these different things. There's just a lot of options and a lot of really great flavor and texture, something that you can sink your teeth into. And it's called Stewed Hobbit, so now we've opened ourselves to puns, but it's really a well-structured, delightful adventure that gives the players a ton of options to solve the problem in any way they want. So, really like that one. The third one is called Kinstrife and Dark Tidings. This is the other dull-ish one, and maybe dull is the wrong word to use. It's not that the adventure is boring. The adventure actually could be very interesting. It's that the adventure has very poor motivations and doesn't have a very strong story to it. The single most interesting part of the entire adventure actually comes in an optional sidebar that says, hey, our playtesters suggested that maybe you could change the motivations in this way and that might be fun for you. And it is jaw-dropping to me that they didn't immediately adopt that, because it is the most interesting part of the entire adventure and I think really makes things come together. So if you play this, my recommendation would be follow that sidebar and you'll know it when you see it. Basically, there was a guy who was a prisoner and like I said, the motivations are all really off, both for the NPCs and for the PCs to figure out what's going on. The stakes are not well established. There's a lot of things wrong with it. Once you put in the effort to fix those problems, you end up with a pretty good adventure. The only other problem I have with this one is that the One Ring travel system, while it is one of the strongest parts of the entire game system, does not lend itself well to tracking, to searching for something through the wilderness. And so they do their best in this one as you're trying to find that escaped prisoner, but it doesn't really gel well. The search rolls and explore rolls and hunting rolls don't combine well with the travel system as it is, just because of the way you have to plan travel in advance. And so how do you plan travel if you don't know where you're going and things like that? Doesn't really work for me. Anyway, Those Who Tarry No Longer, the fourth adventure, this is the straight up bad one. And I don't want to talk about it for very long. I want to talk, because the final three are even better than the Stewed Hobbit one, and they're all great, and I want to talk about those instead. But just very briefly, it involves a big extended dream sequence. Basically, you're supposed to escort an elf and an evil shadow, the Gibbet King, in fact, comes after that elf and traps her. She's a Noldor and is able to trap her in some kind of spirit dream world. And what's going on behind the scenes is that this Noldor brings the characters with her into the dream to help her fight off the monster. But the way the adventure is written, you have to go through not just days but weeks and arguably months being trapped in this dream, being unable to escape and unable to even affect anything before you figure out why you're there and what to do. And so, it is so confusingly presented. I don't understand why they did it this way. It keeps having little things like, make sure to remind the characters that this is a dream. And every time you get into a fight scene or something, it's like maybe, when they take a strong hit, they could almost wake up and then fall back to sleep again. So you're constantly being reminded that you're not in a dream, which in effect, in practice, is going to reduce the stakes. The characters know that nothing they're doing actually matters because then they'll wake up. In fact, there are rules for if somebody dies, they'll just wake up and realize that they can't wake up their friends, which immediately, I think, would signify to any group of players that the way to get out of this is to die. And so what happens is they get attacked by monsters, they get kidnapped, they get captured. It's impossible to escape. It's impossible to not be captured. It's very railroady in that sense. And then they spend, like I said, days, weeks, possibly months in a prison being horribly abused. It is not going to be fun at all to play through this dream sequence part of the adventure, because the entire purpose of it is to show the bad guys beating you down and sapping your will to live, which only works if you know what the stakes are, and only works if you know how to quote-unquote win, which you don't. And it's not until the very final scene of the dream sequence that the elf shows up and says, "Hey, I'm trapped here. You've got to help me fight this thing. Together we can work this off." And then at the end of the adventure you find out that, depending on what you did throughout the adventure, if you were able to add more hope to the universe, then that increases her ability to, fight off this spirit thing, which is not something they will have been trying to do at any point, because they know they're in a dream and they're just trying to escape the dream, not save the lives of these imaginary dream people. It's just a dumb adventure. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. So let's go on to the next one. The Darkness in the Marshes. So this is where we're getting into these final three: Darkness in the Marshes, Crossings of Kelduin, and The Watch on the Heath. These are all phenomenally good adventures. Okay? Darkness in the Marshes takes them into the Gladden Fields, which is this nasty, swampy, marshy thing, and has them really, for the first time, trying to discover who the Gibbet King is, and realizing that there is this ancient, evil, horrible, undead threat that kind of came from Dol Guldur and came from the necromancer in southern Mirkwood and is trying to raise an army. And so you get a lot of really sneaky subterfuge. You get great use of the travel system. You get potentially some really solid combat. There's betrayal. There's adventure. There's all these really good things, and I don't want to go into it too much. But it's a cool adventure and gives the characters a chance to really put the system through its paces and try some things. Okay? Crossing of Kelduin, this is the one which narratively in the long arc, like I said, doesn't make a bunch of sense that the Gibbet King has raised this giant army in the Vale of Anduin, and then instead of attacking any of the many havens in the Vale of Anduin, you've just spent at this point 3 different adventures dealing with the Mountain Hall, for example, or Woodland Hall, or Roscabel. Gibbet King has no time for any of those and is going straight to Dale. And so you're in Dale, and there's a couple of little scenes in Dale, and there's some things going on, and there's some intrigue, and there's some social interaction. Like I said, all of these adventures make great use of the encounter system. But the centerpiece, the showcase of this adventure is a massive siege of the Bridge of Kelduin, which is a bridge across the River Running so that he can bring his army out of Mirkwood and up to Dale. This is an enormous battle and would be, I think, an absolutely brutal experience to run the players through. But the way it is presented breaks it down into bite-sized chunks so that it doesn't actually feel like you're just rolling dice for 7 hours in a row. It's designed, there are little snippets put throughout to give the characters a chance to influence the battle, to be clever, to find ways around the fight, to find, to innovate new ideas of how to defend the bridge in the city. There's social interaction. There's little stories here and there that kind of emphasize the draining of spirit and the failing of hope, but in a way that works really well, whereas the Dream adventure, it didn't. It was just dismal for no reason and with no payoff. This one really tells a compelling story about a siege while also having just round after round of brutal combat. It will be a very different role-playing experience, I think, than any of the other adventures, which is part of what makes it so unique and so cool. So of all of the adventures in this book, this is the one that I am most excited to run some players through at some point, because it gives them the chance to be a part of this epic battle and this massive siege and really find ways to not only win the fight, but to find hope and keep that spirit alive. It's a great adventure. Last one is called The Watch on the Heath, and this is where the Gibbet King's plan comes to fruition. And I don't want to go too deep into what that means, except to say that there's again a ton more travel. We get to use those travel rules. We get to go through the Withered Heath. There's a lot of combat, there's a lot of sneaking around, there's a lot of social interaction, and there is a chance to fight not only some really devastating bad guys, armies of orcs and this evil undead Gibbet King, but also an actual dragon. And so there's just a lot of really great stuff in this one. And it actually seeds it in there with 2 or 3 different options to I'm trying to phrase this without giving anything away. Let's just say that there are some cool environmental options where clever characters can do some super awesome things to help fight off the bad guys if they are paying attention and if they're being clever and creative. And those are just built into it. And so, anyway, really well written, really cool. I think if you did some major tweaking to the dream sequence scenario, then these 4 final adventures turn into, like I said, a really stellar mini campaign involving the Gibbet King rising up, trying to gain power in and around Wilderland. So, Awesome. At the end of the day, this, despite my minor complaints, I do think that Tales from Wilderland, like I said, I do recommend it. I do recommend it really strongly. Of the 7 adventures, 4 are amazing and 2 are still salvageable. And so you can get a lot of really good stuff out of this. Plus, it uses that encounter system super well. It uses the travel system super well. It gives you a chance to explore the core game system and how it works and really kind of test various limits of it. So, anyway, they do a good job, and I think this is a great book. So, Tales from Wilderland for the One Ring. Go buy it and play it, and then tell me how much you love it. Anyway, I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.